Siglo XX con Mike Wallace.
Hoy en siglo XX, epidemia.
It is going to slaughter peoples by the tens of millions over the coming decade.
Las plagas modernas.
We are on the edge of a medical disaster.
El pavoroso retorno de un escuadrón de virus mortales.
More and more strange new viruses are emerging every year.
Soy Mike Wallace y esto es siglo XX.
Siglo XX con Mike Wallace.
Cuando se trata de muerte, las guerras no logran lo que unos pequeños organismos como las bacterias, los virus y los parásitos hacen. En la Edad Media, una epidemia llamada la peste negra, enfermedad mortal transmitida por las ratas, acabó con la mitad de los europeos. Y a pesar de los avances de la medicina moderna, estos padecimientos siguen siendo una amenaza. Por ejemplo, la epidemia de influenza del 18.
Literally, there were millions that died during that outbreak, and it really was one of the most formidable outbreaks that we have ever had in the history of medicine.
Comenzó en marzo de 1918, cuando cientos de soldados del fuerte Greeley en Kansas se presentaron a consulta sufriendo de escalofríos y fiebre. Se habían contagiado de un fuerte ataque de influenza causado por un virus encontrado en los cerdos. Cuando sus compañeros de tropa fueron enviados a las últimas batallas de la Primera Guerra Mundial, llevaron el virus consigo. Desde el frente de guerra en Francia, el virus se esparció con aterradora rapidez por Europa y luego alrededor del mundo.
The most conservative estimates say that 20 million people died in the 1918 pandemic of influenza. However, some people believe that the actual death toll may have been as high as 50 millions.
Ese mismo año, solo en los Estados Unidos, 25 millones de personas cayeron víctimas de la influenza y por lo menos medio millón murió a causa de la misma, muchos más que en la propia guerra. La población asustada utilizaba mascarillas en los trabajos y se automedicaban con todo lo que tenían a su alcance, desde aceite de eucalipto hasta la estricnina. En algunas ciudades se dictaron leyes que prohibían toser, estornudar, escupir e incluso estrecharse las manos. Dado que no existía una autoridad de sanidad pública centralizada que pudiese llevar un control, pocos comprendieron cuán grave era esta epidemia de influenza.
Dateline 1955.
La situación cambió 3 décadas más tarde, cuando otra epidemia mortal se esparció por el país.
Here, magnified 77,000 times, was the dreaded crippler, the scourge of mankind for centuries, the death-dealing virus of polio.
Esta vez las víctimas eran los niños.
There are some 2,000 babies dead of polio and thousands of children left dragging leg braces for life.
And the character of polio wasn't so much a killing disease, but a maiming disease. It was a disease that maimed children. And in fact, the early name for polio was infantile paralysis, which tells you exactly what the disease used to do.
Era una enfermedad que había sembrado el terror en los corazones de todas las comunidades.
Most victims are between the ages of 2 and 4, racked by pain and fever. There is little or nothing that medical science can do. The city tries to quarantine the infected. Panic soon begins. Those who can pack their bags and prepare to leave town.
We know when polio swept through a community, infected very large numbers, probably the majority, like 80% of the community. But amongst the 80%, only 1 in 1,000 showed signs of paralysis. But then these people's lives were blighted forevermore after that.
Epidemics of polio were terrifying each summer. And this had been building up from the 30s and 40s and reached a peak in the 50s. And at that time, there was great hope and expectation that something could be done to relieve people from fear.
Pero en ese momento nadie sabía qué causaba la polio.
Science continues to be baffled by the disease, especially by how it can spread to those never even exposed to polio victims. Suspected carriers range from houseflies and horseflies to silkworms and house cats.
No obstante, se descubrió que los seres humanos eran los transmisores naturales del virus de la polio. A comienzos del siglo, las cañerías abiertas y otras condiciones insalubres en las ciudades norteamericanas habían permitido que los niños desarrollaran una inmunidad natural hacia la enfermedad. Luego vinieron los programas de salud pública para limpiar las ciudades, y eso irónicamente rompió dicha inmunidad. El virus de la polio comenzó a esparcirse.
You might call it a disease of civilization. Its occurrence as an epidemic phenomenon followed the improvement in hygienic conditions and sanitation.
El doctor Jonas Salk era un especialista en la investigación sobre los virus en la Universidad de Pittsburgh, donde en 1947 había comenzado a trabajar en una vacuna contra la polio.
When I was working in Pittsburgh on polio at the time, my laboratory was in the basement. It was right adjacent to the morgue.
Hacia 1952, Salk obtuvo un suero a partir de 3 cepas muertas de virus de la polio que indujo en animales de laboratorio un aumento de la resistencia frente a la enfermedad.
Animal tests proving successful, Salk in 1952 begins testing the vaccine on humans. When you inoculate children with a polio virus, he later confides, you don't sleep well for 2 or 3 weeks.
Cerca de 1 millón de niños fueron vacunados en una prueba de campo nacional en 1954. Algunos niños fueron inoculados, otros solo recibieron una dosis placebo. Las pruebas comparadas indicaron que Salk había encontrado la vacuna contra la polio.
If the results from the observed study areas are employed, the vaccine could be considered to have been 60 to 80% effective against paralytic poliomyelitis.
I believe that the discovery of the Salk vaccine for polio was one of the major discoveries, not only of this century, of any century in medicine.
El descubrimiento condujo a la más grande inoculación masiva de la historia. Las compañías farmacéuticas producían la vacuna tan rápido como podían. Muchos hacían cola para ser vacunados.
And almost immediately, the enemy began to retreat. Polio was on the run. Uncountable thousands of children were spared its terrors, and the great fear of so many childhood summers was lifted.
The elimination of polio through vaccine as developed by Jonas Salk was a major advance to show that these viral diseases could actually be dealt with modern technology.
El descubrimiento médico de Jonas Salk fue uno más de los numerosos y dramáticos que estaban ocurriendo en aquel momento.
Between about 1940 and 1960, I think the greatest discoveries this century in medicine were made, and those discoveries were made against our oldest enemy, our most ancient enemy, infectious diseases. The first drug to treat tuberculosis was discovered in 1944. Penicillin had come to the fore about 1945 or thereabouts. We could cure infections for the first time through medical means.
I think that the great advances in especially antibiotic discovery really changed the history of infectious diseases. Realized that people were dying of local skin infections when they cut their hands, were dying of pneumonia in the young adulthood. Those were major infectious disease problems that were essentially eliminated by the use of antibiotics. And that was for bacterial infections. Then came the discoveries of vaccines, which eliminated measles and smallpox, and so there was a feeling that with all the progress that infectious diseases were not such a major problem.
I think we were all caught up in what I call the age of delusion, because these discoveries, these were wonderful discoveries. In many ways, we thought we had all of these things licked. All the great plagues of history were beginning to fall down on this, what I would regard as a kind of battlefield between medical science and these infectious diseases. So there's a tremendous air of euphoria went through.
Pero era una euforia prematura. A menos de 30 años de la conquista de la polio, los médicos tuvieron que enfrentarse a la más grande peste del siglo XX, el SIDA. Esta historia, al regreso en siglo XX, por primera vez el SIDA confundió a la comunidad médica. Nunca antes los científicos habían visto una enfermedad que destruyera tan rápidamente al sistema inmunológico, la última defensa del cuerpo contra una enfermedad. Dejaba a la víctima a merced de un ejército de infecciones letales, una virtual sentencia de muerte sobre la persona. Y lo que era peor, se esparcía tan rápidamente que pronto se convirtió en una epidemia mundial.
The estimates by 2010 is there'll be somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 million individuals infected worldwide. with about 40 million deaths by that time.
Al igual que muchas epidemias, el SIDA comenzó como algo pequeño. Nadie sabía cómo comenzaba o qué pasaba con la persona cuando ésta se infectaba.
The disease seems to begin with recurrent fevers, swollen lymph glands, loss of weight and appetite, and a general run-down feeling.
I wake up exhausted, and it just gets worse as the day goes on.
Y lo que era peor, enfermedades como la neumonía, la mononucleosis, la tuberculosis, la leucemia y desfigurantes cánceres de la piel invadían al cuerpo sin defensas.
It was devastating, you know. At that time, I was 29 years old. To be told that I had cancer was just, it turned me around.
Bobby Campbell is fighting for his life, one of a rapidly growing group whose battle has fascinated and frightened modern medicine. He has Kaposi sarcoma, a deadly skin cancer that first appeared on the bottom of his feet as spots the size of a quarter.
I mean, people get up in the morning and they don't say hello to the sun. They look for lesions on their legs.
At the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, where 400 cases have been reported, a special task force has now been set up.
Lo que se sabía en aquel momento era que la mayoría de las víctimas del SIDA eran homosexuales que vivían en las grandes ciudades. Randy Shields fue uno de los primeros periodistas que reportaron acerca de la creciente crisis. Él fue víctima de la enfermedad.
Mid-1981, a number of things happened at the same time. Doctors in Los Angeles noticed an unusual cluster of cases of a rare pneumonia among a group of gay men in Los Angeles. At the same time, doctors in New York City noticed that there was a rare skin cancer that was also appearing among gay men. People at the Centers for Disease Control realized that what linked these diseases was the fact that these men were losing their immune systems.
The effect of being told that I was immune deficient was devastating. I called my parents and said, I'm going to die.
Officials say the number of victims has doubled every 6 months since 1978, when the first case is believed to have appeared. There have now been 800 recorded instances of the disease, with more than 300 fatalities, a death rate of 38%.
Aunque las muertes causadas por el SIDA aumentaban geométricamente, nadie sabía qué era lo que causaba la caída del sistema inmunológico.
We don't know what we're dealing with, and it's deadly, and it's transmissible.
What is known is that homosexuals account for 75% of the AIDS cases in the United States. This suggests the disease is transmitted through sexual contact.
Para descubrir quién era el transmisor de la enfermedad, los investigadores del Centro para el Control de Enfermedades se entrevistaron con las víctimas de todo el país.
We had asked so many questions, and the main one was, how much sexual activity do you have? We would try to get very exact, and then we'd come up with 100, 250, 300. One man swore it was 3,500 in the course of the last 10 years, and I challenged him on. He pulled out his calculator and showed me week by week by week. Well, if 2 men have 10 contacts, they're infecting 20. But in a couple of weeks, after those 20 become 40, and when you have 40 men passing it around to 10 each, you have 400 all of a sudden. So the curve went up like that.
As more and more people were investigated, one individual seemed to connect actually the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States. And this was a air steward who had flown back and forth and was sexually very active. And this was the patient known as Patient Zero. Patient Zero on the initial investigation was directly or indirectly connected to 65 AIDS patients in New York and San Francisco. So that was a lot.
El paciente cero fue el nombre que el CDE utilizó para proteger la identidad del portador. Era un canadiense francés de nombre Gaëtan Dugas.
With Gaëtan, you get a horrible combination of circumstances. You get a guy who has got unlimited sexual stamina, who's very attractive, so he has unlimited opportunity to act out that sexual stamina, and he's a flight attendant for Air Canada, so he gets these flight passes so he can fly all over and have his fun, you know, in any number of cities. I mean, it was just a horrible combination of factors that helped really speed this disease into every corner of America.
A medida que se estudiaba la enfermedad, había alarma por la alta tasa de mortalidad.
Where you started seeing initially 30 and then 50 and then 70% and then ultimately 90+% of the individuals who would get infected would die. It was clear that we had a major disaster on our hands.
El público en general estaba convencido de que se trataba de una enfermedad de homosexuales, pero pronto se demostró que el SIDA atacaba a otras personas.
Now it's been detected in Haitian refugees. No one knows why. And in heavy drug users, especially in New York City. No one knows why. And in some people with hemophilia, a disease that prevents blood clotting so the patient needs frequent blood transfusions. Why?
Los precursores de la investigación fueron los franceses.
It was at Paris's Institut Pasteur that the first major breakthrough on the cause of AIDS took place, the isolation of a virus which may be responsible.
We think it took some time before we are convinced ourselves we had something different and something new.
The scientist's best guess is that the virus enters the body through a blood transfusion or infusion of sperm, then lodges in cells in the lymph nodes. There it stays, dormant, until excited by some shock to the body's complex immune system. Then the virus breaks out and spreads like wildfire.
Un año más tarde se logró aislar el virus conocido como VIH en Norteamérica, virus de inmunodeficiencia humana. Además, habían descubierto un medio para multiplicarlo.
The breakthrough came at the National Institutes of Health, where a way was found to mass-produce the AIDS virus, study it, and most importantly, to test blood for it.
It should solve the problem both for blood transfusions and for hemophiliacs in the sense that when this test becomes commercially available, then of course we'll be able to screen blood.
Pero la prueba de VIH llegó tarde para los miles de hemofílicos que habían sido infectados con SIDA por medio de sangre contaminada.
For the nation's hemophiliacs, AIDS has now replaced bleeding as the #1 killer. That is because the AIDS virus can be transferred through blood, and every year 6 million Americans, including hemophiliacs, depend on donated blood for survival.
The epidemic of AIDS in the hemophilia community was preventable. If you asked anyone on the street, should you take the plasma from a gay man and put it into something they use for treatment of people, I don't think it would take a rocket scientist to say that you probably shouldn't use that material.
La sangre contaminada también se coló hacia los hospitales con resultados trágicos para víctimas de accidentes y pacientes de cirugía.
I've already buried 3 of 4 patients who went for open heart surgery in New York City. They went to the most modern institutions to get their open heart surgery and have contracted AIDS from their open. Their hearts were fine, but they died of AIDS.
Con tantos reportajes sobre contagios accidentales, el miedo al SIDA se extendió rápidamente.
AIDS hotline, may I help you?
AIDS hotline, may I help you?
AIDS hotline, may I help you?
Yes.
And across the country, there's been a sharp increase in calls to AIDS hotlines. The new callers, largely heterosexuals, worried they'll get it too.
Heterosexual people who are concerned about being in a high-risk area or eating in a gay restaurant or knowing gay people.
People worry about getting it in swimming pools or saunas. They worry about getting it from public telephones or by handling money.
You know, there have been, I think, something like 13,000 cases of AIDS diagnosed in this country, and there's not one of them that has been casually transmitted.
Pero los expertos decían que los heterosexuales sí tenían de qué preocuparse.
Who is at risk for AIDS?
Potentially everybody. Every person who is sexually active with several partners or with new partners. Casual sex is really a luxury that we can't afford very much anymore for the time being.
Of the 2 million people infected with the AIDS virus, who are the most likely to carry it into the heterosexual population? There are the men who have homosexual partners and who also have wives and girlfriends. There are prostitutes. And there are the intravenous IV drug users, many of whom are heterosexual.
It is IV drug abusers that are the conduit of this infection between them and the straight world. They are giving the infection to the straight world.
El conocimiento sobre la amenaza del SIDA obtuvo un gran impulso en el 85 a partir de reportajes no confirmados de que una gran estrella de Hollywood había sido víctima.
The once robust, square-jawed Rock Hudson had looked gaunt and sickly in recent public appearances, including this one last week in Carmel, California, with longtime co-star Doris Day.
Primero Hudson negó los rumores, pero después voló a París para consultar a otros médicos.
After 3 days of confusion at the American hospital in Paris, a spokesperson for Rock Hudson finally confirmed that the actor has the deadly disease AIDS.
Mr. Rock Hudson has acquired
immune deficiency syndrome, which was diagnosed over a year ago in the United States.
Hudson fue la primera figura pública que contrajo la enfermedad y su muerte atrajo la atención mundial hacia la creciente epidemia.
Even before the Hudson disclosure, more and more big-name entertainers were publicly supportive of fundraising efforts to combat AIDS. With today's announcement, organizers expect the list to grow.
Pero el gobierno federal tardó en responder a la creciente crisis. Fue solo 2 años después de la muerte de Rock Hudson que la administración de Reagan comenzó a apoyar públicamente los esfuerzos para encontrar una cura del SIDA.
I just come from the ward you have here for children who have AIDS. And let me just make a promise to those children and all others who have contracted this disease. I will do all that God gives us the power to do to find a cure for AIDS.
For critics of the Reagan administration's handling of the AIDS epidemic, it was an extraordinary day. The president, who for years had rarely mentioned the disease, was holding a baby born with AIDS. The occasion was the unveiling of the new Presidential Commission on AIDS, a study group formed after more than 22,000 people have died from the disease, and perhaps another 2 million have become carriers.
How can we most justly and effectively protect the public from the spread of AIDS?
Critics say the president's new attention to the problem is too little, too late.
In the context of the lives that are threatened by AIDS and the fact that it is the worst epidemic of the century, no, I think the response of the Reagan administration has been inadequate.
When you get into the politics of AIDS, you look at one very unfortunate timing factor of this epidemic. AIDS was detected 5 months in to the first Reagan administration. And consequently, during the first years of the epidemic, whenever there was a choice between do we go whole hog against this epidemic, or do we keep the lid on domestic spending, the Reagan administration invariably chose to keep the lid on health spending.
The U.S. government's response to the AIDS epidemic bordered on public health malpractice. That response led to AIDS getting such a strong foothold in this country.
A medida que la epidemia del SIDA crecía de forma alarmante, muchos afligidos por la enfermedad estaban dispuestos a probar todo, sin importar lo que fuera, con tal de detener el avance de la misma. Esta historia, al regreso en siglo XX, federal coordinado contra el SIDA y sin esperanzas de cura, las víctimas desalentadas se encaminaron en todas las direcciones con la esperanza de escapar de la sentencia de muerte.
There is no known cure for AIDS, but many men who have it, no one knows how many, are now crossing into Mexico to buy an experimental drug, isoprenosine.
The drug that drives many AIDS victims to Paris is HPA-23.
Across the country, people carrying the AIDS virus have formed buying clubs to search out AIDS remedies that remain unproven.
Underground clinics now offer access to 6 different unapproved AIDS treatments.
My choice is between taking ribavirin or just winging it on my own.
I'm going to be dead in 2 years anyway. Why can't I try something that will maybe improve the quality of my life?
Dennis is part of a nationwide underground network of 45 so-called guerrilla clinics, spreading the word of untested chemicals some believe can slow the progress of AIDS.
Aun cuando las víctimas usaban toda clase de remedios, el público continuaba creyendo que se encontraría una vacuna contra el SIDA, como sucedió con la de la polio. Muchos se animaron cuando supieron que el Dr. Jonas Salk, el inventor de la vacuna contra la polio, estaba trabajando en una vacuna que él esperaba pudiera inmunizar contra el virus del VIH.
I tried to understand how the virus thinks and how the virus carries out its strategy. So to develop a strategy to defeat or outsmart the virus.
Pero era una enfermedad muy distinta de las que cualquier científico había enfrentado jamás.
It's a very complex virus. This virus is sneaky. It keeps changing its outer coat. So one day it may be wearing a white coat, the next day a pink coat. And the immune system has to constantly gear up to recognize that before that virus will further damage our tissue. And this is making the attack on the disease very complicated.
We're going to need major biological breakthroughs in order to get a vaccine.
Bottom line on a vaccine would be we don't know if one is going to ever be possible.
Sin abandonar la posibilidad de encontrar una fórmula mágica, los científicos entendieron que la búsqueda de tratamientos más efectivos era mucho más apremiante.
We've got to develop an approach that will stop the virus, but also allow the immune system to continue its job.
It will be something more akin to giving insulin to a diabetic. You don't cure the diabetes, but you can allow them to lead a reasonably normal life.
Un medicamento llamado AZT parecía cumplir el propósito.
Scientists administer the drug AZT to patients who have the HI virus, have a low immune cell count, which puts them at risk, but so far haven't had any symptoms of AIDS. Another similar group got a placebo, a useless pill. The study found the progress of the disease was significantly slowed in those getting AZT.
With these results, we are witnessing an additional significant milestone in the battle to change AIDS from a fatal disease to a treatable one.
It's been a long time waiting for something to offer us and our patients some hope, and this does that.
Hope, but not a cure, a point stressed by officials who announced today that test results on AZT were so amazing that scientists decided it would be unethical to withhold it any longer from patients who might benefit.
Adding a year to my life is the greatest thing anybody has given me.
We already know that it's not a cure. But like I said, it will keep me healthier until one is found.
Pero la AZT producía efectos secundarios y perdía su efectividad después de un año, cuando el virus del VIH se adaptaba a ella. Igualmente, la AZT bajaba el número de glóbulos rojos, lo que causaba anemia y obligaba a los pacientes a hacerse transfusiones de sangre. Sin embargo, los pacientes preferían pagar el precio de tener anemia a fin de ganar tiempo y mantenerse con vida. Pero para muchos, un precio más alto era el costo del mismo medicamento.
When the FDA approves AZT under its brand name Retrovir, many of them may stop getting it because they can't afford it.
We estimate that the annual cost of Retrovir to patients could be in the range of $7,000 to $10,000.
The cost cited by the drug's manufacturer is only part of the cost of AZT treatment. Frequent medical checkups, treatment of side effects, and blood transfusions to fight anemia caused by the drug can add another $6,000 a year.
This is an autopsy suite.
El costo del tratamiento no era un gran problema para el doctor Mahlon Johnson, quien se contagió del VIH cuando realizaba una autopsia en un paciente que había muerto de SIDA en un hospital en Nashville, Tennessee, en el año 92.
It was just a split-second slip of a scalpel, and it just happened incomprehensibly fast.
7 months later, on his 39th birthday, Johnson found out he was HIV positive.
I knew immediately that I was about to embark on a rather interesting battle, and that there had to be some way to beat this death sentence.
So Johnson found a few studies which showed positive results in patients who early on were being treated with the drug AZT in combination with other drugs. Most doctors waited until patients developed full-blown AIDS before they prescribed AZT, because if taken too soon, the thinking was the AIDS virus might develop resistance to the drug.
My view was that you might as well go on and take some gambles.
Johnson convinced his doctor to put him on a virtual alphabet soup of antiviral drugs: AZT, 3TC, DDI, delavirdine, and IL-2, a cancer drug that researchers were testing on AIDS patients.
Some people were saying, these are the only drugs we have. We need to hold them till you really need them. But from my view, it was much better to die fighting than to start fighting when you're dying.
La apuesta del Dr. Johnson dio sus frutos. Sus células CD4, que constituyen el sistema inmunológico del organismo, aumentaron considerablemente como respuesta al tomar el medicamento IL-2.
The day before I took IL-2, my CD4 count was 320, and then after 2 months, I took it again, and my counts rose to 920. It was just like, whoa, if I could dance, I would have at that point.
Not only have Johnson's CD4 cells remained high, but researchers who test Johnson regularly can no longer find the virus in his blood.
But it could be in your lymph nodes still. We don't know that the virus has cleared the body completely.
But when you look at his blood, you don't see any evidence
It
of
says
the virus?
non-detectable. But then we have several hundred patients right now that are probably showing the same thing.
Muchos pacientes como el Dr. Johnson tomaron un inhibidor de la proteasa, un descubrimiento contra el SIDA.
How do they work? HIV is a virus that infects healthy cells and then uses 3 key enzymes to reproduce. Drugs like AZT attack just one of the 3. The new protease inhibitors attack a second enzyme. It's the 1-2 punch, the combination of different drugs working together, that is having such promising results. Promising results not only in people like Johnson, who has never developed full-blown AIDS, but also in thousands of people literally dying from the disease.
It's hard even to conceive of how I felt a year ago, because I no longer feel as though I'm dying. I no longer crave it. I don't have contingency plans to end my life. I'm not in that mode at all. I'm back among the living.
We're at that critical point where we know we're doing really well, but we don't know how well it's going to be. Will other things intervene that might dampen the enthusiasm that we feel now? Namely, will the virus reemerge in a resistant form? The other possibility is that the toxic effects might ultimately preclude someone being able to stay on the drug for a period of time and might even outweigh the benefits.
Pero la terapia a base de múltiples medicamentos fue el tema principal en la Conferencia Mundial sobre el SIDA en el año 96 en Vancouver, Canadá.
Here at the 11th International AIDS Conference, the most promising new combination drug therapies have gained wide praise for their results.
The optimism is at an all-time high right now. We could essentially knock the virus down to a level where we can no longer detect it in blood.
We are at a crossroads in the history of the HIV pandemic. For the first time in a very long time, we are beginning to see glimmers of hope.
Pero ese optimismo estuvo atenuado por la cautela.
I think it would be rather foolish. It would be the same complacency as before if we assumed it's going to be the cure. I have my doubts that it'll be a cure, but I think it might be the best treatment we've had so far, which might greatly help many sufferers.
El SIDA enseñó a los médicos una lección de humildad. Las plagas mortales no eran cosa del pasado y, de hecho, la epidemia del SIDA parecía ser el anuncio de una nueva era de serias enfermedades mortales. Esta historia al regreso en siglo XX. La epidemia del SIDA en los últimos años del siglo XX parece culminar una edad dorada en la medicina, una edad en la que los más antiguos enemigos de la humanidad, las enfermedades infecciosas, habían sido controladas por vacunas y medicamentos. Lo que era particularmente alarmante para la comunidad médica era que el SIDA parecía ser el precursor de toda una partida de nuevas enfermedades mortales, acarreadas por profundos cambios en el ambiente y en la conducta humana.
Every which way we turn, we are changing nature. We're so arrogant, really. We think we can do what we like, but we're forgetting that all of life on Earth is part of a matrix, an interconnecting matrix, supporting each other as part of this huge symbiosis of life on Earth, and I think that when we ignore this, we do so at a peril, really.
Se convirtió en una aterradora realidad a finales de siglo cuando, según los expertos, hay nuevas y aterradoras enfermedades mortales como producto de la manipulación del ambiente por el hombre.
Medical researchers around the world are searching for a vaccine against a deadly disease that broke out recently in Africa.
Well, it was the 1976, when I received one of those telephone calls from CDC, could you be on an airplane and go to Sudan? I had been the head of the smallpox program in Sudan and knew the country well. And there was an unknown infection way down in the south of Sudan and wanted to know if I would be willing to go down and help. And I said, in retrospect, fairly casually, I said, of course I would. And went down. It was a very, very interior area. It took us days to get down there, actually. And when we got down there, half the nurses and doctors in this quite large hospital were already dead.
Lo que los mató fue un virus mortal llamado fiebre del ébola por un río africano del mismo nombre.
It is not a human virus, but comes out of the African jungles into humans, basically accidentally. It's something that has a short incubation period, kills 70% or so of the individuals it infects, and burns out very quickly.
Ebola virus is a monster. It's a true monster.
El virus apareció sin aviso, atacaba al sistema sanguíneo, producía hemorragias severas y en muchas víctimas una muerte muy dolorosa.
You die in ways that are almost unimaginable. Your blood begins to clot up. Clots which lodge in your brain, lodge in your lungs, lodge in your intestines, lodge everywhere. And then the rest of your blood then becomes like the blood of a hemophiliac, loses its ability to clot, and streams out of all the orifices of your body, all of them, including your eyes.
People become deranged and manic, and it's a real nightmarish kind of thing. If you talk to scientists who've been in the middle of Ebola outbreaks, it's really the stuff nightmares are made from.
Those first few days were terrifying. Walking around with full respirators in tropical Africa is not a pleasant experience, and trying to deal with the patients taking blood from individuals was scary, but I knew very well entering in that it was often the laboratory workers and the first investigators that came down with disease, and this looked like a bad disease. I did not know that if I had stuck myself with a needle, I had about a 90% chance of dying.
La fiebre del ébola fue peligrosa en ese momento y continuaba siéndolo, ya que ha sido recurrente durante las últimas 2 décadas.
In the African nation of Zaire, U.S. health officials confirmed it today. There has been an outbreak of the deadly Ebola virus in at least one location.
The outbreak of the deadly Ebola virus in Zaire is growing. By some accounts, the death toll has climbed to 48.
The death toll in the deadly Ebola outbreak in Zaire continues to mount. 64 of the 79 people who have so far contracted the virus have died.
They buried their dead today among stern warnings not to wash their corpses, as is the custom, for fear of spreading the disease.
Pero el virus sí se esparció y mató a más de 200 personas en la primavera del 95 como consecuencia directa, dijeron los científicos, de la expansión humana hacia hábitats nuevos.
2/3 of all life on Earth exists in the rainforest. And since all of those forms of life are carrying viruses, that means 2/3 of the viruses on Earth also live in the rainforest. So to go into a rainforest and start chopping it down is a particularly dangerous thing to do.
I think the more ecological changes that occur where humans get into new environments or build new environments, the more chance that it is that they will pick up new infections.
People are out there moving earth, moving forests, moving vast pieces of the land into new arrangements. And humans have to adapt to that. And as humans attempt to adapt to that, they will very likely experience new diseases.
Medical anthropologist Carol Jenkins hopes to head off those new diseases.
Small changes in the ecological settings of remote places end up very often affecting the whole world.
Jenkins and her research team are working in remote rainforest areas of Papua New Guinea. Monitoring the health of the villagers there.
They have been here for many decades. They've been in the general area for many centuries.
But the logging here is new.
Now, our concern is that everything shifts. You might start to get more killers. You might start to get new ones. And if you get new ones that no one's had before, the people have no resistance, they will really feel it. It will be a disaster.
Los científicos temían que las fuertes lluvias causaran la aparición de un misterioso virus al sur de los Estados Unidos en el año 93.
There was a lot of rain last year, which created an abundant food supply for the mice.
The pines produce lots of pinon nuts. The mice that eat the pinon pines multiplied like crazy. They happen to be the carrier of the virus, would come into houses, and their excreta would dry on the floor and then be brought up by aerosols when people were sweeping their houses.
Una vez inhalado, el virus causaba devastadores resultados.
Young people who were perfectly well in the morning could be dead by evening, and they drowned in their own secretions. It was a very, very dramatic and painful type of illness.
Health officials on the Navajo reservation are using every means possible to let people know about the mystery disease, the deadly illness which has already killed 11. Up to 27 people have become ill, mostly Native Americans.
El Centro para el Control de Enfermedades solo especulaba acerca de su causa.
We don't know whether if it's an infectious disease, it's a bacterium,
a virus, mycoplasma, you name it. So we're starting at zero, and we all think it's a new disease.
Fear level's high at this point.
Fear level is high. People are dying.
The CDC sent out researchers to the Southwest.
So these field people were working with the states to get samples back here that we could then analyze in the lab.
Nobody knew what it was. They couldn't identify it. It had never been seen before. Even the pattern of the illness had never been seen before. Now we know that it was caused by a totally new, to medicine this is, type of virus called the sin nombre hantavirus. But you've got to realize it isn't new to nature, because when they looked for its source in nature, it was found to be a virus of the commonest wild mouse in America, called the deer mouse.
Scientists knew about a strain of hantavirus that caused outbreaks in Europe and Asia. During the Korean War, it struck 3,000 UN soldiers. But this was the first time they had identified a strain of virus that caused a large outbreak in North America.
It's the most lethal strain of hantavirus ever seen. You know, America always does things well. If anyone does something and America takes it on, America does it better. So when America gets a hantavirus, it does it a lot better than any other place, and that's what it did. Because the lethality of previous hantavirus was only about 10%. The American hantavirus, 70%.
Al cabo de un año, el virus Hanta comenzó a aparecer en todo el país.
Tests are underway to find the source of the deadly hantavirus that killed a Long Island man.
Virus carried by rats was just confirmed in South Dade yesterday.
A total of 60 cases have been reported in 16 states. 36 people have died. Experts predict the virus eventually will turn up in every state.
Y este es el problema con las nuevas pestes, se expanden rápidamente.
Clearly, in the old days, if it took 2 weeks to come across from one place to another with a ship and everyone who had the disease would die, then it was hard to transmit a short incubation period infection. Now with airplanes crisscrossing the world, the ability to transmit new infections is markedly increased. And when infectious diseases are introduced into those situations, they will spread very, very effectively.
Y se han expandido. Como causa de muerte, las enfermedades infecciosas se incrementaron en 58% entre los años 80 y 92.
Once ranked as the 5th most common cause of death, infectious disease has now jumped to the number 3 position, behind only cancer and heart disease.
The 3 major culprits are the microbes that affect the respiratory tract, the lungs, HIV, and bloodstream infections.
In the United States, the outbreak of AIDS has contributed to the biggest rise in death from infections. But even without AIDS, the death rate from infectious disease has risen substantially.
More and more strange new viruses are emerging every year, and that's part of what I would regard as a rather dangerous scenario at the moment.
El Dr. Ryan, quien ha dedicado su vida al estudio de los virus, se preocupa acerca del futuro y de un teórico virus que él llama el virus X.
A virus X scenario is a scenario where a new virus, a virus we've never met before, to which we've got no drugs and no vaccines to control it, comes out of an area like the rainforest. The virus is almost wholly lethal, but more importantly still, it spreads by aerosol, in other words, like a common cold or an influenza. Now, if either the Ebola virus when it emerged in 76 or if the AIDS virus when it emerged in 1980, if either of those had spread in that way, they would have posed an extinction threat to the human species.
No es la euforia vivida en los años 50 cuando los científicos habían proclamado la victoria final sobre las enfermedades infecciosas.
What we did is we assumed these little life forms like bacteria and viruses and so on. We thought they're little chemical bags, static little entities. Once you've got a drug that kills them, you slot them away because now they're defeated, but they're not, because they're forms of life constantly changing. And the way they interpret it is you put an antibiotic into their environment, they mutate in such a way as to develop a resistance to that antibiotic. That's the reason they've ruled the world for 3 billion years.
Comentarios finales al regreso en siglo XX. Las plagas de la Edad Media eran tan destructivas y abrumadoras que los estudiosos de la época estaban convencidos de que la humanidad estaba por desaparecer. Pero hemos sobrevivido y la humanidad ha combatido exitosamente otras plagas que aparecieron en los siguientes siglos. Al final del siglo XX, una nueva serie de enemigos microscópicos está al ataque. Sin embargo, hay razones para creer que la ciencia médica, una vez más, probará ser competente.
All of this is just an evolving competition between us, the smart individuals, and the infectious agents who are relatively stupid but find their ways into us, and it's a matter of us just having the wherewithal to do something about it.
Pero es poco probable que la comunidad médica vuelva a sucumbir ante la ilusión de que las enfermedades contagiosas puedan ser eliminadas para siempre. Tal como lo dijera William McNeill, nunca trascendemos los límites del ecosistema. Estamos atrapados en una cadena, lo queramos o no, comer o ser comido. Soy Mike Wallace y esto es Siglo XX.